So it's an anticipation chemical. It's the difference in you sitting down at a restaurant and ordering, cheesecake versus spinach, right? Because
no
the last time you ate the cheesecake, that dopamine rush, it was so good. And so what you're craving is that dopamine hit that you get when you put that bite in your mouth. And so because of that, it's super important that we take care of this as educators with our students because it controls motivation, right? If they're anticipating what's going to happen in the classroom and they're anticipating learning and creativity, that's a powerful motivator. And so we want to make sure that their dopamine isn't being hijacked and used in the wrong way.
Welcome to the BJU Press Teacher Edition podcast, where Christian educators are encouraged and inspired as we bring you interviews, practical ideas, strategies, and answer your questions about teaching in today's culture. And here's your host, Jenny Copeland.
Welcome back, everyone. All right, I have a question for you. Have you ever taken time to think about thinking? Stop for a second and think about thinking. How do you describe a thought? How are those thoughts formed? And how can a thought, which is ridiculously hard to define, determine an action? Okay, so we are in for some fun in today's episode. We're going to talk brain science. But before we dive in, I first want to thank you all for being here and welcome you to the show. Thanks for making Teacher Edition podcast part of your day. As we get started, let me remind you once again, take a minute and subscribe to the podcast. If you have friends who are not listening in, you need to share this podcast with them as well. Don't forget to follow us on social media. We are Teacher Edition Podcast on Facebook and YouTube, by the way. And you can find us on Instagram and TikTok at Teacher Edition Pod. Once again, Teacher Edition Pod. We would love it if you would take a minute to also leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. I know that that's something that you have to intentionally take time to do. I have to take time to do it when I listen to other podcasts. I have to think about it. But leaving a review really helps others find the show as well. So take a minute to do that if you're enjoying the podcast. And lastly, we are still looking for your questions. So take a minute, go to the website, teachereditionpodcast.com. There you can subscribe to the emails, but also submit that question. It's a simple click of a button and you can record your question. And for all of our listeners, be sure to listen all the way to the end of our episodes because when we have a question to share, we will do that at the end of the episode. So you don't want to miss out on that. Okay, so back to our question. Do you ever think about thinking? So Jennifer Miller is here to dive with us into this topic. Jennifer has served in Christian and public education for years. She has been both a teacher and an administrator, and she's currently serving as a national consultant for BJU Press. So I first met Jennifer, I was trying to figure, I think it was back in 2017 or so. The Lord gave us an opportunity to serve together at a school for several years. Jennifer and her husband have three children, 2 grandchildren, 1 on the way. And Jennifer has just done some really interesting work in thinking about thinking. So today we're going to talk about that. I'm excited for what she has to share. So Jennifer, welcome to the Teacher Edition podcast.
Thank you, Dr. Copeland. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so as we get started, I guess I need to ask a question that no doubt some listeners are already thinking. So I have my Teacher Edition and my schedule, and maybe I've taught long enough that I have it all memorized. What does it matter? As long as I cover what's in the book, we're in good shape, right? Or maybe not. So Jennifer, why is the science of the brain something that educators really do need to be interested in? What do you think?
Well, as you know, the best laid plans. So we have our teacher's editions, and some of us have been teaching for years, and we have that under our belt. But adding the students to that mix sometimes is interesting, right? So they bring something to the dynamic that we can't just study our content. And I think now more than ever, we have to study our students and know how they learn and study the learner, know your audience, form those relationships. Because it's just not enough anymore to know just your history or your science or your math. You have to know the student.
Okay, so we have all heard someone say they are wired differently these days. And I couldn't agree more. Some of the things that students are into or they want to be when they grow up are things that we would have never even heard of probably when we were children. But beyond that, the world and the culture around them are just so distinctly different. So Jennifer, what would you say are some of the things that are different about the current generation of students? Maybe more specifically, what is different that didn't seem to be a challenge in previous generations? Maybe we could put it that way.
Right. So I think if we study the science of the brain, right, I think the answer to your question is that they're not wired differently. So the way that God created our neurons to fire, our senses to send those messages and signals to the brain, that has not changed. I think a better description might be that they're conditioned differently. So I know, I'm aging myself a bit, but, I grew up in the late 70s and 80s. And I just remember, it was not okay to be bored. My mom and dad would send me outside, ride your bike, get some sunshine, don't come home to the streetlights, come on, those kind of things. And so I think the immediate gratification culture is really conditioned our kids differently than they used to be. So while things were a temptation for me, like, the technology that we had available, it wasn't at my fingertips. It wasn't as readily available as it is today. Getting exercise was just not a problem. We played a lot more. And if you were bored, you were just bored. And that led to a lot more creative thinking opportunities, I think. I think sometimes we as educators and parents, we think, oh, my child's bored. It's my responsibility to make sure that they're not bored. But that leads to creative thought and creative, thinking. And so we want to be purposeful in the things that we're providing for them, but also being okay sometimes that they're bored, and allowing that creativity to come out.
Let's unpack the topic of dopamine a little bit. So Jennifer, what would you say? We hear this topic these days when it comes to brain science and talking about, the way people are responding. What would you say makes dopamine such a powerful contributor to a person's ability to focus and learn, since that's, what we're talking about when it comes to the brain?
Right. So to answer that question, I think I'll back up just a little bit and talk about the brain itself. So
okay.
If you think back to your science days, or if anyone out there that's listening is a science teacher, we know that the brain is divided up into different sections called lobes. And there's a very important part of the frontal lobe, which is the prefrontal cortex. And it's super important to educators because it is the factory. It's the place that controls like executive functioning, regulating of emotions, speech and language decoding, emotion regulation, problem solving, those kinds of things. And so it is a very, very important part of the brain that I think that educators would benefit from studying more. And then when you add dopamine to the science lesson, right, to the mix of what we're learning, we can talk about dopamine as a neurotransmitter. So it's that signaling molecule. It's sending messages to the prefrontal cortex and giving it the message to do these very important things that we as educators are, so excited about. We want them to be motivated. We want them to be learning. We want them to have impulse control in our classrooms, and those kinds of things. So dopamine actually acts as a neurotransmitter and a hormone in the body. But for the talk on education, I think we need to funnel it down and focus on it as a neurotransmitter and why it's so important. One of the reasons that it's important is because it is a pleasure chemical. And so it's kind of lumped in with some of the other pleasure chemicals that we think about, right? Like serotonin or oxytocin or endorphins, because it does make us feel good. And so it could be called a pleasure chemical, but I think it's more aptly called an anticipation chemical, because unlike serotonin or oxytocin or endorphins that are all about the moment, right? So if you stub your toe, you're going to get a heavy dose of those endorphins helping you with that pain, or serotonin helping you sleep or regulate your mood. Those are all things that are in the moment. But dopamine is a future-facing chemical. So it's an anticipation chemical. It's the difference in you sitting down at a restaurant and ordering, cheesecake versus spinach, right? Because
no
the last time you ate the cheesecake, that dopamine rush, it was so good. And so what you're craving is that dopamine hit that you get when you put that bite in your mouth. And so because of that, it's super important that we take care of this as educators with our students because it controls motivation, right? If they're anticipating what's going to happen in the classroom and they're anticipating learning and creativity, then that's a powerful motivator. And so we want to make sure that their dopamine isn't being hijacked and used in the wrong way.
Okay, so you shared a lot right there. I'm not sure if I followed all those very long words. Would it be fair to just say that it's a bad thing? A dopamine is a bad thing. What category would you put it in?
That's a great question. I think there is some train of thought out there, right? That we need to stop the dopamine, craze that's happening because I think educators are becoming more and more aware of the term and the chemical itself. But rather than studying it, we just kind of nix it because we're busy and we have things that, we want to do. And so what happens is we're ignoring how God created the body to maintain our dopamine levels. So each person has a dopamine baseline. Everyone's, different, just depends on, genetics and circumstances, but everyone has sort of a norm, what's normal for you. And the thing about dopamine is, and just like with everything that God created, it was created for our good. It's something good. And that echoes back to Genesis, where God said, God saw it and it was good. And that includes the way he created our brain, and even the synthesis of dopamine. And so the fantastic thing about God, the way God created it, and it's just so genius, and I know I kind of geek out about these things because I'm a science teacher, but I just love how God put into our normal circadian rhythms the things that we need to maintain our dopamine baseline. Things like proper sleep and proper nutrition, sunlight, even meditation. And so if you read, secular writings on this study, they'll talk about, things like yoga and meditation. But we know as Christians that this is meditating on God's word. This is hiding God's word away in our heart. And even that creates a way for us to maintain that dopamine base. And as a Christian, as I study this, it really is just, it makes me want to worship God even more because I think about the fact that not only did he give us the normal rhythms to maintain that baseline, he gave us that reward system so that it does help us feel good. And it's rewarding us for things that are for our own good and survival, right? True. So if we think about things that naturally release dopamine, like exercise, okay, or food, or even just achievement, like using our gifts and our talents, our musical abilities and our gifts, it's like God is giving us reward each time that we do those. And why is that? Because he wants us to do it again. He has that future-focused anticipation chemical given to us so that we want to do those things again, and it helps us to thrive.
Okay, so let's take this in the classroom since we're educators and this is a podcast for Christian educators. So what would you say are some of, let's go back to what you talked about earlier with the immediate gratification that we're seeing. What would you say are some of the repercussions of immediate gratification and the culture, specifically as it applies to teaching? How do you see that connection?
Yeah. Well, as a teacher, you and I both know, and those that are listening out there, probably if you've been in the classroom any number of years, even 1 year, 2 years, that sometimes we start to feel like entertainers rather than educators, right?
Absolutely.
We're coming in the classroom and we feel like we're standing on our head and we have to do a song and dance because they're just not paying attention anymore. And we don't understand why. And that's so frustrating. I remember, starting my education journey as a teacher in 1997. And, I had a little treasure box with pencils or stickers. And then I just know as the years went on, I was spending more and more money on,
That's
little
right.
toys and gift cards and, all these things, trying my best. And then it dawned on me, there's something going on in the conditioning of the brains. And so I think we as educators might be a little in the dark as to what's going on, but technology companies, toy companies, TV producers, game producers, they're not in the dark about the dopamine. They know exactly what they're doing. As a matter of fact, these companies hire behavioral psychologists, cognitive psychologists to work on their teams to do exactly this. They're leveraging the dopamine synthesis process for their advantage, for money advantage, right? And then we as teachers are going, why can't I get their attention? And we can't compete, And because of that, the motivation and anticipation for learning has been hijacked by these other things. And I don't think anybody, including parents, are doing it purposefully, but it's very, very in the background, and we need to bring it to the forefront so that we are in the know and we can take it back, so to speak.
Okay, so often when we play charades or such, we have a very stereotypical gesture for the school setting, especially the teacher. I don't know how that always happens, but I wonder what our charade action might look like if we were describing one of these children. So Jennifer, what does a child who's been affected by this immediate gratification culture look like in the classroom? Now, maybe not charades, but what is the look of one of those children? What are we seeing?
Well, I'd say that they look bored, right? They look bored. They look like they aren't interested in maybe the things they were interested in before. So they have a narrowing of interest. They aren't interested in things like forming relationships, maybe playing an instrument, doing a puzzle, doing artwork, things like that. So they're not reaching their full potential because those things cannot compete. And if we dive a little deeper into the why behind that, if we look at dopamine, talking about that baseline that we talked about, what we've done, as with all things that God created as good, is we have corrupted it, right?
Of
we
course,
as human beings have corrupted it. And so I think it is important that we as educators, as with all things that God created as good that have been corrupted, we need to be seeking to redeem that in our students. And one of the things we need to realize is that we as human beings can purposely spike our dopamine baseline. So let's go back to my cheesecake example. I must be hungry. I can think about cheesecake.
Hey, it works. I'm all in.
Yes, right. Exactly. So let's think about that piece of cheesecake. So if I eat a piece of cheesecake for dinner, that's going to spike my dopamine, and it feels great in the moment, right? And then through my normal, regular routine, my sleep habits, my normal nutrition habits, exercise, whatever, that dopamine baseline is just going to go back to normal. But what happens if I eat that cheesecake and I say for breakfast the next morning, I have another piece, and then as a snack, I have another piece, and then at dinner, I have another piece? Well, then we have a problem. Then we start leading toward an addiction, right? And so anything that is a repeated behavior like that keeps spiking our dopamine baseline causes the baseline over time to lower, so that it's an equal and opposite reaction. The more we spike it consistently over time, not just a one-time thing. We're not saying, a kid could never play a video game ever, but if you do it repeatedly over time and you're stimulating that dopamine to spike above the baseline, then it's going to lower and lower over time. So then you have kids coming into your classroom and going back to your question of, I'm bored. And teachers have no idea what in the world to do to bridge that gap. So, they're used to getting it in a very short gap between the stimulus and the effect, which is the dopamine. And we want them to get the dopamine how God intended it, which is over time. We want to widen that gap.
Okay, so this is really engaging. This is a lot to think about.
It is.
Okay, so one last question for you. Hopefully on the very positive, practical side, what do we do? So is there anything that we as educators can practically do to help this issue? All just the bundle of what we've talked about. How can we respond to this as a Christian educator?
Right. I think first and foremost is to just remember that we are just one part of the puzzle, right?
Yeah.
And to not be discouraged. And remember, as educators, we love to be fixers because we love our students so much. And we love to be that teacher that the parent says, oh, when they came to your class, this issue all went away because of your methodology. Just remember that this isn't one that you can fix overnight, right? You might not even be able to fix it in an entire year. So I would say a good goal for us as teachers is to take something that, or a child that has a gap this big from their, stimulus, whatever that is, to their dopamine hit, because, all summer or at night or in the car or whatever, they're playing game after game after game or watching show after show after show, or even toys,
Sure.
Have these things, certain toys. And we want to make a goal to widen that gap as much as we can while they're in our classroom. And there are some practical things that we can do. First of all, we want to be purposeful in our technology, right? So technology is not the enemy, just like dopamine is not the enemy. Technology is not going anywhere. We teach digital natives. We want to make sure that we don't treat technology as the enemy. And so what can we do? We can be purposeful in the technology that we're giving them.
Yeah.
Technology is a wonderful tool for creativity and for building and synthesis of ideas and collaboration. So we want to make sure that we're using it for those things which cause the dopamine to be spread out over time the way God intended it, as the child has to work for achievement, right? We don't want to be giving them educational games that are constantly simulating like TikTok, swipe, 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 or a game that has sounds and lights that constantly hijack that multisensory learning, and it's repeated. Okay, there's nothing wrong with reward, but when you have immediate gratification every single time,
Right.
And then a lot of games will add in things like, hey, if you want to win this game, you can earn it with 500 more coins or
yes.
coins. Yeah. And then we're teaching them to waste, the money that, we shouldn't be wasting, right? We're teaching them gambling habits, which there's a whole study of how this leads later down the road to, more addictions, adult addictions, and things like that. So we want to just make sure that we're being purposeful. We're not burying our head in the sand and just not using any technology, but being purposeful with the technology. And then replacing those things in our classroom with things that will spread their dopamine production out over larger gaps of time. Maybe not all at once, but over time. So that's one thing that we could definitely do.
Okay, so I'm seriously trying to not do the pun thing, but you have really given us a lot to think about, seriously. And I think we're all going to be more keenly aware of that as we're out and about, and maybe even listeners, as they interact with their students, will think of these things and how we are doing what you just described. So Jennifer, I know your time is so valuable, but I really do appreciate you being here today.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on here. I love the topic. I was happy to come and talk about it. And I think I'm by no means the ultimate expert, but, I'm an educator just like all of you. And I love to study things like this and share it with other people. So thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And this is just such a great topic that maybe doesn't get covered all the time. So you did a great job, and I really appreciate you being here. And listeners, thank you for joining us today. I hope you were challenged and encouraged as I was. Remember to go to teachereditionpodcast.com to submit questions for upcoming episodes. Of course, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on social media. Now, it's time to get back to your day. But it's not just any day, because every day in the classroom is your day to impact and inspire through God's power and through His grace working in you. Go do what God has called you to do.